Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. Dan Wolkenstein, hope you had a great Memorial weekend. Everybody I know is either at the beach. I know you were doing barbecue, I think, not once but twice this weekend. So you had a lot of meat going on the grill. In general, I hope everybody enjoyed the long weekend. The Chargers return back to OTA starting tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. But Dan and I wanted to take today to talk about, and this will actually be a little bit of a recurring subject matter of an episode here over the next several weeks as we get closer and closer to training camp. But we're going to break down some of the biggest storylines heading into the 2024 season. Obviously, big storylines as it relates to the Chargers as soon as we get into training camp. And we're going to talk about each one of those in separate episodes. So this will be the first of many in terms of the biggest storylines for the Chargers this offseason. Before we get into today's subject matter, Dan Wolkenstein, sir, how are you?
I'm good, man. How are you? You talked about me. I had a lot of smoked meat. Felt good. Little meat sweats. Can't hurt nobody. Memorial Day weekend was fantastic. Thank you and thankful to all that serve and have served and have given the ultimate sacrifice. But I'm good. Excited for this week. Got a lot of stuff coming. Special guest episode later this week. Today, we're talking all things defensive line as a storyline. But again, how are you? How was your weekend?
Had a really good, solid game night on Saturday night. And opened up a bottle of Traveler. Dan, my first time actually trying this particular bourbon. It's a one-way trip. I'll tell you that much. Traveler is a one-way trip. You don't need a lot for it to take you on a trip. That's for sure. So I kind of understand whoever distilled this, why they named it Traveler. I got it now. So, but it was good. It was a nice Saturday.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, like I said, we're going to get into all things defensive line, go into why it needs to improve, some of the struggles it has had in years past, and what they've done to possibly bring reinforcements, both from the coaching staff as well as on the roster. But Jake, before we get to that, let's pay the bills real fast. Let's talk about our friends.
I want to remind everybody that BetOnline is your number one source for all your summer sports this season. Baseball, golf, NBA, and NHL playoff stats. All the latest stats, news, and scores available for you to follow for all your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, odds, and for just about every sport that is out there. Head on over to the website today. That's betonline.ag, or use your mobile device to get into the action. Going over to BetOnline and use the promo code UNLEASHED. Once again, that's BetOnline, where the game starts.
So, Chargers fans, I feel like this might bring back some old wounds, maybe some trauma. The defensive line for this Chargers team has gone through quite the overhaul, retool, reload, whatever term you want to use, and for good reason. And sometimes I think Chargers fans get caught up in the names, right, with Thule and Mack and Bosa, which, if we're being honest, they had all three last year, and the defensive line was not good. And you could say, oh, well, Khalil Mack had, the 17 sacks. Team defense was terrible. And defensive line as a whole was terrible, which we'll get to. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why Jim Harbaugh has been very specific about what he has done, the resources he's brought in to help improve on some of these struggles. And while the problems aren't fully these guys that you're seeing here, there are some things that these guys can do and need to do to help this entire line improve in 2024. So I guess to kind of set the stage, the question I asked for you, Jake, is, and we'll go through this, but looking at the defensive line, let's just say under the Staley era versus maybe what we all envision or hope or know it should be, biggest issues or biggest differences that you see?
I'll say this from the personnel standpoint as it currently stands right now in May of 2024. It's hard to do a 1-to-1 ratio based off of what we can expect it to look like, because there has been so much turnover as it relates to this defensive line since Brandon Staley left. But I think when you look at it in terms of what didn't pan out for the Chargers in terms of their free agent moves,
there's a lot.
I mean, you could virtually go to almost every single one of them, whether we're talking about the free agents, um, you know, for Tito being in this system. I know he was coming back from his injury, so he wasn't able to get ramped up the way that he wanted to earlier in the season. When he was on the field, he was one of the Chargers' best run stoppers that they had in that type of unit. And what you see now, after the departures of Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson no longer being there, Morgan Fox has really had to kind of carry that load. But you have a lot of unknowns behind it, which is now becoming the bulk of your defensive line. So in general, what was it that the Chargers struggled with? Especially from the interior, couldn't get after the quarterback, couldn't stop the run, which were two things that Austin Johnson and Sebastian Joseph Day were specifically brought in for.
Kind of important for a defensive line to do.
Yes. And unfortunately, those just did not end up panning out. And for whatever reason you want to think that it didn't end up panning out, whether it was fluctuation in personnel along the edge, certain guys that were in and out due to injuries, general defensive line cohesion, you could go to a multitude of different things. Coaching probably is a very big one of them. Coaching probably is is one of the biggest, which is why the Chargers basically did a break it all down to the foundations, full on overhaul with Jim Harbaugh and what Jesse Minter has done to bring in some other positional coaches that we'll talk about here in a minute. But just in general, Dan, every attempt that the Chargers had to even just hit a single for the defensive line never ended up panning out for them. So it was a mess from the get-go, truly.
No, and I wanted to kind of provide some context and some numbers here, because I think sometimes you lose sight of how bad things were. And, Khalil Mack really made a crap sandwich look edible at times, that it just was not good. And so I pulled up some numbers here. So this is according to Pro Football Reference. I was looking at some pressure numbers and knockdowns. Pressure percentage in 2023, last year, 19.9%, 20th in the NFL. Again, 19.9% pressure percentage. Now, in context, Lions, Chiefs, Dolphins, and the Jets all had above 27%. Chargers are down there at just under 20. 2022, almost identical. 2 years in a row. 2023, 19.9% pressure percentage. 2022, the year prior, 19.8%. So basically, that was who they were. Quarterback knockdowns, not great. They were not getting pressure to the quarterback. This was even worse. Knockdowns in 2023, 28th in the NFL with just 6.4%. 24th in 2022 with just 7.5%. So pressure, knockdowns, not great. And that is the defensive line primarily that brings quarterback pressure, quarterback knockdowns. And as I was starting to go through, Jake, this is where it got wild to me. And you brought it up. In areas that you would expect that certain position groups would be carrying the team, unfortunately for the Chargers, they were oftentimes, and more often than not, all the time, the weak link of the defense. Like, you go back and look at some of the numbers according to PFF or whatever numbers you want to use, and the defensive line grades, talking about the Scott Matlocks and the Morgan Foxes and the Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnsons, and heck, even sometimes Khalil Mack and Tito and all those guys, the numbers that you would expect defensive linemen to carry for you, and things like pressures, pass rush win rate, tackling, run defense, they're towards the bottom of the entire defensive roster. And you can't have that for a team who's trying to play physical, who's trying to win at the line of scrimmage. You just can't.
Dan, I'll piggyback from what you were talking about in terms of stats that just are really eye-opening as it relates to the defensive line in general. The Chargers finished 29th last year with a 35% pass rush win rate, 25th with a 30% run stop win rate. Even with Khalil Mack's 17 sacks last season, he didn't even end up in the top 20 for pass rushers with a top 10 win rate. The only Charger that actually ended up in a top 10 of any list was actually Thule, and that was for top 10 in run stop rate for him. He didn't even end up in the top 10 or 20 for pass rush win rate. Even he may not have the sacks to back it up, but we know how often he was at least disrupting the quarterback. But even still, that wasn't enough to land in those rankings. That was per ESPN. That's how bad in general, not just talking about the edge rushers who his primary objective is to get after the quarterback. You're looking at it from both the edge and an interior defensive line, where this Chargers team has struggled so much over the last 2 years. And how many times have we heard that same little stat that always likes to rear its head up every time, where Justin Herbert is 22-6 when his defense holds them to a certain amount of points? How many times have we had to watch Justin Herbert attempt to put on his best Superman impression by having to play from behind instead of playing with a lead? These are all factors that go into this over the last, and you could garner this all the way back from 2020. The Chargers just have not been able to figure this out, even with different coaching regimes. But man, the last 2 years, in terms of the reinforcements that you were brought in specifically to impact those two things, were just a huge swing and a miss.
They were. And I'll give you some more numbers to kind of put salt in the wounds here, so to speak. This is according to PFF. And we've talked about like the depth that has been sorely missing for this team across the roster, but evidence now for the defensive lines that we're talking about. Overall defensive grades. These are numbers are from PFF. So overall defensive grades, and then I'll get into pressures and run defense. Overall, Mac, Bosa, Thule, right? Those are the top three. 91.8 for Mac. Clearly had a solid year. Solid understatement. Bosa, 78.4, although I think he only played 9 games. Thule, for as much as we're all excited about Thule and for as dominant as he was at times, kind of took a step back towards the end of the season. I think the rookie length of the season kind of got the best of him. 71. All three of those aren't bad, right? Great to above average for all three of those. Then look at the drop off here, Jake, for the next one. Again, this is just overall defensive grades. Nick Williams, 59.7. Morgan Fox, 58.0. Austin Johnson, 45.7. Scott Matlock, 36.8. Okay, that's just overall defense. You go from a 91 and a 78, and 78 was Bosa playing in 9 games, Thule at 71, and then you're down to the 40s and 30s. Here's some pressure grades for you, Jake. Again, Mac and Bosa lead the rip, right? 86.3 for Mac, 80.3 for Bosa. Again, but Bosa just played 9 games. After that, look at this steep drop-off. From 86 and 80, Morgan Fox and SJD, again, this is on pressure, just 64. Austin Johnson, Jake, 49.3. Scott Matlock, 46.5. Morgan Fox chilling at 43.1. Scott Matlock rounded it out at 38.8. 38.8. Now, okay, well, maybe the interior is not supposed to be good at pressure. Let's go run defense. Here's some numbers for you. McAdooley again. 90.8, 88.4 respectively. Bosa down at 70.7. Niagara Falls drop off. SJD down at 54. Nick Williams at 51. And Austin Johnson at 48.4. For interior defensive line, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And they are atrocious. We're atrocious at it. So, as much as the defensive line really isn't being talked about that much in the offseason compared to the other positions, it was one that crippled this team for years because there was no depth. There was no effectiveness. And you can blame players as well as the coaching staff, obviously. But man, it was not good. And that's why there's been so much focus on it from the staff.
I said this leading up to the draft, Dan. Defensive line felt like a scary priority, or not a scary priority, a sneaky priority that they could target earlier in the draft than what it expected. And hell, we'll never know. Maybe they would have targeted it earlier, depending on how their board fell. But again, you look at it now, and you still say to yourself, it's like, how is this all going to pan out? How is this all going to pan out? You just had up there a second ago, Poona Ford being the key free agent signee for the defensive line for this season. Obviously now Bud Dupree up here as well, Justin Ebogbe, who you targeted in the draft. You still have Scott Matlock, who we're hoping to see a lot more of in year 2. You have Tito, who we would assume is going to be coming back and being 100% healthy. Morgan Fox, who, even though from those standpoint in terms of numbers, Dan, he was probably the one that I felt like ended up having the biggest impact of all the free agent signings. It may not have ended up in the numbers, but I felt like you saw his impact along the interior more than the likes of Sebastian Joseph Day, more than the likes of Austin Johnson. And I still think that having him as part of this rotation is going to be good for this team moving forward. But what is it ultimately going to look like now? Well, I think that the Chargers did a good job, obviously, with what they did with Thule and his start of his rookie season. You go out and you get Bud Dupree to help reinforce it. Now you actually have an idea of what the Chargers are going to do. Holding on to Bosa, Mack, and Thule together with those three, it's still unfortunate from the standpoint that when we got to see them was just so infrequent last year. All three of those guys just playing in one game.
But when they did, it was like insane. Wasn't it? I forget the number, but it's something like 45 snaps and they had 10 or 11 sacks. It was stupid.
It was a huge jump. And the fact that even under a different scheme, you were still seeing those three pass rusher sets where Bosa or Thule would kick inside. And you'd have a combination of Bosa and Thule, or it was Mack and Thule on the other side. And to where it just, every time that Joey Bosa was kicked inside, it looked like it was a mismatch. And it seemed like every time that he was in there, it was either a sack or it was a pressure, it was an incompletion. Something was happening that was good for the defense when those three were on the field together. That's one thing, if you want to take away, that was a good sign that you could hopefully build upon for this next year. And I believe that Jesse Minter wants to do that. But how is it ultimately going to look? Because there's still a lot of question marks with this. So if you want to talk about some of the free agent acquisitions and how ultimately that's going to tie into the philosophy of what this team wants to do. Dan, we remember, and we had talked about this with Chris Harry, when it was before free agency. And I remember the interview with Jesse Minter that took place where he said, I would love to keep all three of those guys, meaning Mack, Bosa, and Thule. And at that point in time, we didn't think that in terms of either Bosa or Mack, that both of them were going to end up returning.
Yeah, we were basically like, yeah, I would too, but not happening.
Yes. But in this universe, that's exactly what ended up happening. So not only do you have what Jesse Minter wanted, you got Mack, you got Bosa. Now you have Thule, who's going to come into his second season, which if anybody has listened to the Jesse Minter mic'd up, you already know what Thule's been doing, even in OTAs out there, and Harbaugh and Minter have been very impressed with that. And then you go out and you sign Bud Dupree, who had a very good year from his standpoint in terms of his age, being a starter, what he was able to contribute to Atlanta last year, and he's coming in as edge 4?
Edge 4 doing the dirty work, man. He is a lunch pail kind of guy.
The Chargers have never been that deep before in terms of, and here we go again with just the narrative of Joe Ortiz. Not only do you have your incumbent starters, but now you got some pretty damn good depth behind them as well. Now, how is this all going to work? Because the Chargers, unfortunately, as we just read off the stats, they can't just rely on those 4 guys to get after the quarterback or disrupt everything. I feel like they've put a lot of stock in that previously, and it just hasn't worked out. And even when they've tried to reinforce it with the interior defensive line, that hasn't worked out either. So it's just been miss after miss after miss. So how do you do this? Here's what I really like from not only Jesse Minter, Dan, but a coach that we haven't talked about that often leading up to this point in time, is the addition of Mike Elston. You go back and you watch their time together in Michigan. These guys have been coaching there together over the past 2 seasons when they were there at Michigan. And specifically leading up to that national championship game, there was comments that Jesse Minter made that I thought were really pertinent, more so from Mike Elston. But in general, they were talking about having the defensive line work as a cohesion, where we're not just going to rely on this group to do one thing or this group to do another. It's going to be one solid message for that group of the interior and the edge guys working together. And I think that's the part that has been missing from the Chargers standpoint for a number of different years, where Jesse Minter can say, actually, I apologize. This is how Mike Elston put it. He called Jesse Minter the most intelligent defensive coach that he has ever played with. And Mike Elston has a long track record of coaching. And the reason that he said that was Jesse Minter knows the right defense to dial up at the right time. He's never been around someone that's been that intuitive for what the defense needs at that particular moment. So now you take that into account to say, okay, well, how is this ultimately going to come to fruition with the personnel now? And if we can see that Khalil Mack can have a 17 sack season, I'll be 6 of them in one game, but still, that's pretty impressive for a guy with his age to basically do it, as you said, Dan, making chicken salad out of chicken, what. The possibilities here for not just relying on one guy to go out and perform like that, it's now going to be, can we have 4 guys that are going to play like that? Can we have 5 guys that are going to play like that? Jesse Minter would love to be a defense where he could say, I want to just have 4 guys that are capable of getting after the quarterback, and so we can drop 7 into coverage.
I asked Chargers fans, when is the last time you saw an effective and consistent interior defensive line for this team?
We're almost 20 years, I think, from the last time that we saw anything like that.
And for those who haven't seen it, Bud Dupree was on the Green Light Pod and was talking about a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the conversations that I thought was really interesting was he was asked about, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically, who is the edge's best friend? Would you rather have a dominant edge on the other side of you, or would you rather have a dominant interior guy? Which one helps you the most? And very quickly, he'd rather have the dominant interior guy. You think of the Justin Simmons type, or you think of like a Chris Jones type, someone who makes their life so much easier because, of one, they're great interior pressure guys and can do their job at a very high level, but they're right next to him. And so they make his life so much easier for if they want to go do some stunts, they want to hand off and stuff. So if that's the case, this Chargers edge group hasn't had it. They haven't had the thing that helps them the most. And even Khalil Mack hasn't had the Joey Bosa for that long either, because he's been hurt. And so the effectiveness and the depth and that cohesion and them working together, that's the part that this defensive line has not even come close to. Not even close. Like, when is the last time we saw the closest I remember seeing, honestly, in the last 3 years has been with Morgan Fox from the interior. Because at times, Morgan Fox has been really good. And I think he's been underutilized, but he's also kind of undersized. But that's the closest we've seen, along with what you were mentioning, where you had Bosa kick inside or Matt kick inside. But from the interior guys, you just don't have a presence that is consistent. Morgan Fox came in like situationally at most, but there was no one who manned the fort, who was kind of that pillar in the middle that dominated, or hell, was even above average. That's what I think this staff and this roster is building towards. You mentioned it, the cohesion of the line, and not just the edge and the interior separate. They're the same family. They got to perform together.
Mike Elston also went into, and these were comments that he was making last year that I would assume that would be taken into account for what this, new Chargers philosophy is going to be. But he talked about the effectiveness of his defense at Michigan was being able to be in a position where you could rotate guys. And I'm sure from the standpoint, if you look at the Chargers defense last year, how often were they playing behind? It felt like it wouldn't take that long for them to feel like they were gassed out there. And again, when you don't have your starters performing at the way that you would hope that they would be performing at that point, what you brought them on to assist you for, you can't put all of that on rookies at the time for the likes of the Scott Matlocks of the world and expect there to be a huge jump in production. So if the Chargers can get into a area, which again, Chris Harry talked about this, how about the Chargers play with a lead? How about them being able to lean on this defense for a change? And I know
the defense through. That'd be nice.
Exactly. And I know that we've talked about a lot on this show since free agency came into play and the draft has already passed about the linebacker group and the secondary and what that's going to look like. But everything's going to start up front. If this unit can, and even Dan said this multiple times, in terms of the defense as a whole, if you can get to just middle of the road, that's going to be a huge jump for this team. If this defensive line can get to the middle of the road, doesn't necessarily have to be top 10. I don't think that anybody would think that that's realistic expectations for them at this point in time. But if they can be middle of the road, that in turn is going to affect the linebacker group and the secondary tremendously in terms of their overall improvement. So like they say, everything starts up front.
And again, like you think of the macro, right? Give Justin Herbert an average defense and watch how good the wins start tallying up. Watch how quickly they come in. The whole narrative of Justin Herbert has been kind of cut off at the knees because of factors completely outside of his control. And that's not relinquishing any blame from him because there are things that he could do better, obviously. But if we're being real here, he hasn't had much help from the opposite side of the ball. And I'd argue most of the time it has been a hindrance. There have been how many times now where you've seen Justin go down, play hero ball, get the lead back with a minute left, only to see the team lose? Or lose in a 38-36 style game. Week 1 last year. Look at the Lions game last year. Look at just over and over. I can remember the Chiefs games. There's just a lot of them. Give him an average defense, which I think this will be better than average. But just that's what they need. And the defensive line, especially in a Jim Harbaugh, Jesse Minter style team, the versatility, cohesion, the depth, being able to rotate guys in, keep them fresh, prevent injuries, all of that stuff. Like that's all crucial. But they all play on a string, and you're as good as your weakest link. And we can point to, Chargers fans, Jake, you can point to the weakest link of this defensive line week over week over week. And opposing offenses just got to choose. All right, do we want to roast them over the top? Want to throw over them or just run down their throat? Either one we could do. Let's just pick one.
The last thing I'll say on this is you kind of had the light bulb go off in my head when you were talking about staying healthy, rotating, everything like that. Mike Elston also mentioned the fact that Ben Herbert was involved in these type of week-by-week preparations for guys, in terms of guys that were performing well for practice and how that would help elevate their playing time. And again, here's just everything goes back to the little things that Jim Harbaugh is installing. We've seen it a little bit now during OTAs. You're in game uniform. You're tucking your jersey into your pants. There's no music out there on the field. It may seem trivial to some to say, well, how is that going to impact someone on the field? Dan, I've said it backwards a few times over the last couple of weeks, but what is it? Practice the way you should play.
Practice like a pro.
There you go. All of these little things, as much as Ben Herbert loves to talk about the attention to detail, make sure that weight is that weight plate is correctly straightened. All of these details are part of a bigger picture that the Chargers are trying to get to on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, the micro lessons bleed into the macro lessons of life in all times. And what you do in the dark sheds light. What you do in the dark shows up on Sundays. And if you don't establish those healthy habits to where that is just like clockwork, you don't have to think about it, you could just go. That's where these little things become big things. And why Chris Hayre was talking about this, why he's so bought into it, why it matters. Because we've seen the alternative of those little things not being focused on. And how many breakdowns have we seen, especially on the defensive side? We can talk about the offense later, but how many defensive breakdowns have we seen where we're like, that should not have happened? And we can blame coaching, right? Like, coaching is a big issue, and I'm not saying it's not. But there were countless times that Chargers fans saw defenders in the right position, and they just choked. They just did not make the play. And you could say, well, coach's job is to get him in a position to succeed. Well, they did. And you can also say, well, coaches are also there to make them better players, maybe, but still, like, you gotta stand up during the minutia and do it the right way. And then come Sundays, Mondays, Thursdays, Super Bowls, you're shining. And this defensive line has to shine brighter than it has. It has been so dark, especially on the inside, but even on the outside. Like I said, Khalil Mack made a lot of stuff look better than it really was. And even with the 17 sacks, if you go look at like some of the grades, they're not 17 sack crazy. You would think that they would be off the charts everywhere. And like you mentioned, pass rush win rate, just it was a weird season. And he was able to clean up a lot of the things that other guys kind of helped him with. But one guy doesn't win Harbaugh mentor style defenses. Like, it's a team. And you always hear about the team from Jim Harbaugh. And what's good for the hive, good for the bee, or whatever that phrase is that you hear all the time. That's what's enticing to me about Jesse Minter and this defensive line with Elston at the helm and Jim Harbaugh, is how much this is more about everyone collectively. Because, Jake, you have talked about it. The depth from roster position number like 8 or 9 down to 53, it's like precipitous how stark that contrast is. The underbelly will be better. And that's going to be what sets aside this defensive line, I think, from the lines in the past. A storyline to watch for sure, and one that I think will have a huge impact. Jake, anything else on the defensive line you want to talk about today?
I think is again, as you mentioned just now, it's like to say, like, okay, expectations. Like, like I said, nobody expects this group to come in here and be a top 10, even with a 4-man rotation of Mac, Tooley, Bosa, and Dupree. I don't necessarily need them to be a top 10. Nobody should be expecting that much of a jump. But as Dan said, if you can effectively help the drop be not as huge as it is from your starter position to your guys that are playing in that second and third rotation, that's really what's going to help things.
And hell, if you're in the front, if in an interior, just be effective. Like, give me one guy who's effective,
sure,
a starter.
Sure. But I think that where the weight is going to be put on this defensive line is now going to be put across everybody collectively. It's not just going to say to, like, okay, well, this is the interior defensive line's responsibilities. That's going to be different than what the responsibilities of the edges. Obviously, naturally, just based off position, that's different. But in terms of how they're coached and what the new philosophy is going to be, and that, Dan, honestly, is more of the reason for the optimism here than anything else. Because you guys, you have now, even with guys like Dylan Rooney in there, who's also part of Michigan's defensive line, you got so many guys that have collectively worked together and made a winning formula of it for the last couple of years. The only thing that's different now is the personnel. How do you affect that? How do you coach that? How do you improve their play? How do you improve the player of the younger guys that are not necessarily these big name starters that have been in the league for almost 10 years now? How do you do that? This coaching philosophy, to me, is capable of doing that. This is not a retread in my eyes. It's not that at all. This is something different. The Chargers have been failing at essentially using the same philosophy under the same front office for 10 years. How do you change that?
I believe
we're in the early steps of that.
Yeah, in this brain trust, I trust. They brought in such an overhaul on this staff, and for good reason. And this staff, I believe, will rely on its brain trust to bring out the best of this team. Now, can that happen all in year one? We all sat here and talked about this is probably going to be a multi-year thing. While I do believe they have kind of fast-tracked and done a lot more than I thought they could do in one offseason with all the moves and all the restructuring and all the retooling of this roster, top to bottom. But it's still only been one offseason. And we have to manage our expectations and be realistic here.
Yes. I would expect to wherever we see this team that's going to land as far as, let's just crystal ball. You get to the end of 2024, whatever you think the stats that we just rattled off for the previous year's defensive line were, I think that we could collectively say that we would expect a nice jump. Not significant, but a nice one. Like we said, middle of the road.
Healthy.
This is still only year one. I would go forward in time to predict that the way that the Chargers attacked the offensive line in terms of their prioritization this year, I would really expect them to put that same type of mindset into the defensive line for next year, because the personnel that is coming out next year, it's deep for the defensive line, and I'm sure the Chargers will shift their gears a little bit to put some high priority there, which will only end up making this defensive line improve that much more for the years to come.
100%. So lots of pressure on this defense to improve, and that starts in the trenches. We've heard him talk about that over and over and over again. And defensive line is kind of the tip of that spear. So needs to improve, needs more depth, needs more effectiveness, and needs more cohesion, all of which we just talked about. This team should be providing. It's been fun. Jake, we will continue on this week. We have a few episodes and some fun surprises, so stay tuned, Chargers fans. If you have not done so already, please hit that like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton. For Jake, Chargers Unleashed, LA Football Network, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.